What is the creepiest unsolved crime you have ever heard of? I dated a guy a while back whose father was a retired cop who had worked the watered-down area near Burlington, Ontario. From what I remember, there were several break-ins over the course of a few months that all occurred in the middle of the night while the residents were home. Nothing was ever stolen, no one was ever harmed, and there were no signs of forced entry. The intruder would just stand beside the bed, sprinkle some baby powder over his feet to leave an outline, just to let them know he had been 3 feet away watching them as they slept. They never caught the guy. Not too creepy, but in 1974, workers from the Dowling Construction Company of Indianapolis went home for the night. They left a crane sitting with a 2.5-ton steel wrecking ball hanging 200 feet off the ground. The next morning, they came back to work and the wrecking ball was gone. Everybody, police included, were baffled, and the ball was never found. The McStay family disappearance or murder. A family of 4 with 2 boys ages 4 and 5. One day, they just disappeared from their home, left eggs out on the counter, bowls of popcorn for the kids left on the couch, their dogs left outside, the doors all locked with no sign of forced entry. Their car was found later in a mall parking lot full of newly purchased toys, the kids' car seats strapped in, and the driver and passenger seats left in a position appropriate for the parents' sizes. No one had any clue where they went or why. 3 years later, their skeletal remains are found in 2 shallow graves 170 miles from where the car was found. I live in San Antonio, Texas. There's a story about a maid walking into a room and seeing this man wrapping up sheets soaked with blood. She started screaming. He took off. The cops showed up and found blood all over the bed and in the tub. They followed the trail of blood outside, but it was raining, so they lost it. They found out he was at another hotel. He killed himself right before they opened the door. Well, they never found out who he killed. He had been seen bringing a woman over to his room. The city had a lot of construction going on in the 60s, so they think he threw the bag in some cement. The Sauter children. On December 24th, 1945, Jeannie Sauter, mother of 9 children, went to bed in their family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Some of them were allowed to stay up while she did so, and she fell asleep. She was woken at midnight by a phone call, and a woman's voice asked if someone Jeannie didn't recognize was there. Then it laughed and hung up. She also reported hearing noises on the roof. After having fallen asleep again, she woke up in the early hours of the morning to the smell of smoke, finding the house on fire. She and her husband managed to rescue 4 of the children, but when looking for their ladder, the husband found it missing, and none of the family's trucks were working to go and get help with. 5 children went missing, and though apparently bones and organs were found in the ashes of the house, they were deemed by a coroner to belong to an animal. Then, Mrs. Sauter received a letter postmarked from Kentucky in 1968 that contained a picture of a young man with Louise Sauter. "I love brother Frankie. A little boys, A90132 or 35, written onto the back. The family still believes their children were kidnapped and possibly taken to Italy, as I recall the family having moved from there to the US years previously." The Caddy murders. This was the loose basis for the movie The Strangers. Took place in 1981. A 36-year-old woman and her 5 kids were staying in a cabin outside of Quincy, California, in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I actually live somewhat near this area. It's truly a remote, forested, summertime cabin living type of place. On the night of the crime, the oldest daughter stayed the night at a friend's cabin. When she returned in the morning, she found her mother, 15-year-old brother, and his 17-year-old friend completely massacred, and her 12-year-old sister missing. The victims had all been bludgeoned with a hammer, tied up, stabbed, strangled. Blood was splattered everywhere. Furniture was smashed into pieces. Walls were pounded on. A steak knife had been used so forcefully that it was bent 25 degrees. Whoever committed the crime had gone on an absolute rampage, and was apparently there for about 10 hours. Curiously, the mom's 2 youngest sons and their friend who was staying the night were found unharmed in an upstairs bedroom. Only one of them claimed to have heard or seen anything, but he was so young that his statement was pretty useless to the police. Of note is that the unharmed friend was the prime suspect's son, although that guy was eventually released by the cops due to a lack of evidence. The murders were never solved. 3 years later, part of the missing 12-year-old girl's skull was found about 50 miles away. She had been decapitated. Also worth mentioning is that the resort where all this happened was never the same after. People avoided it for years. It fell into disrepair and kind of became a ghost town. Squatters and bums would stay there. Some rich guy bought the resort at one point and tried to bring it back to life, but I think it's still largely avoided. The cabin where the murders occurred was finally demolished in 2004. The Somerton Man. A body was found on Somerton Beach, dead and propped up against a seawall. There was no obvious cause of death. The man had no identification. No one claimed the body, and he matched no missing person's description. In the 40s, this wasn't completely unheard of, so it wasn't big news. But then the case got weird. In tracing his path based on the train or bus tickets they found in his pockets, they discovered his suitcase, which also had no identification. In fact, labels were cut out of the clothes. It wasn't that someone lifted his wallet when they found his body. He'd purposely hidden his identity ahead of time. A second examination of the body revealed a tightly rolled up piece of paper with the words "Tamam Shud" on it, loosely translated to "It is ended," hidden in a watch pocket of his pants. Someone came forward with a copy of a popular poetry book, the Rubaiyat, that they had found in the backseat of their car near where the body was found, and the last page, which should have contained the words "Tamam Shud," was torn out. Except when police tried to trace this version of the book, it was one that had never been printed anywhere. Although the book was popular, the typeset, size, and shape of this copy was completely unique in the world. The back of the book had a mysterious code written in it, and 2 phone numbers. Actually, it had been written on the torn-out back page, but the indents were still visible on the back cover. One number was a bank, the other was a nurse who lived blocks away from the beach. The nurse insisted she didn't know the man, but when shown the body, detectives agree she clearly appeared to recognize him. The nurse had been an army nurse during the war and had been known to give copies of the poetry book away to another man, an army intelligence officer. The nurse's identity was kept secret for many years, but within the past year, her children have come forward and said she confided to them that she did know the man but never gave any details on how, and that she was a spy during the war. The code written in the book was never cracked, even though virtually every code breaker in the world, amateur and professional, for the past 60+ years has given it a go. Oh, and that poetry book, the Rubaiyat, another copy of it, also completely unique in the world. Its title page said it was a 7th edition. But the publishing house had only printed 5 editions of it, was also linked to another mysterious death of a high-ranking government official. He was found dead in a park with a book open on his chest. A woman who testified at the inquest of his death was found dead in her bathtub, wrists slit open. And guess who frequented the hotel bar across the street from the park he was found in and had given a copy of the book to another man there 2 months after he died? The nurse. The article linked gives a much more thorough explanation with a few weird theories. Highly recommend checking it out. Such a creepy case. A childhood friend of mine, whom I'll call Jean, was the only son of an immigrant couple. They had him in his latter years, so he lived a completely sheltered life and had a complete lack of social skills and social development. They had no other family around, only friends, mostly other immigrants from the same country. Jean's father was very well off, but he lived like a miser. So Jean grew up thinking they were middle class, bordering on poor. When Jean was in his 30s, I think, his father passed away from an illness. Shortly after that, his mother was tragically struck by a vehicle and killed as she crossed a busy street. So Jean was left all alone and in charge of a fortune and assets he was ill-prepared to handle. Out of nowhere, a relative from the old country appeared, She was a young, attractive woman, supposedly a distant cousin. Soon, she was seen with Jean here and there, not too often, but often enough that some people took notice. 3 months later, Jean simply vanished. No one knew where he went or why he wasn't around. And now the cousin had control of the fortune. Another friend of the family got concerned and called the police to report him as a missing person. The guy in charge told the friend to never inquire again about Jean, to better leave this matter alone. No one knows what happened to Jean, but several of us have some guesses. Has no one here mentioned Susan Powell? She disappears on the same weekend her husband takes their 2 young boys on a last-minute camping trip in the middle of the winter in Utah. The investigation goes on for over a year. No one hears from Susan and no one finds a body. Her husband and father-in-law end up getting arrested at different times for unrelated charges. Their kids are taken away. Then, when her husband gets a day of visitation, he lets his boys walk through his front door, slams it in the social worker's face, uses an axe in both his young boys, then blows up his house. And still, no one has any idea what happened to Susan Powell. Terrifying. There's that one where one of my step-family members, dad's been married quite a few times, hired a man to burn up all their farmland in order to claim insurance money. The man ended up burning himself alive, crawled 5 miles to their house. They were afraid he would turn them into the police, so they attempted to nurse him back to health on their sofa. He died 3 days later. Family secrets, man. Better not tell them to your husband and divorce him a year later. Here's one to creep out the Reddit demographic: the smiley face killers. Young college student males, intelligent, athletic, and popular with everything going for them, wind up dead floating in some body of water. When investigators determine the location where the corpse entered the water, they find a smiley face graffiti. The link says that the killing occurred across the USA, but we had a similar case in Alberta, Canada. The young man's body was not found immediately, and the family had offered a reward. The body was found floating in the North Saskatchewan River by a man contracted to inspect drainage outlets for the city. He tried to collect the reward, but the family refused, and the city canceled his contract. The fired contractor was perhaps one of the most qualified people to figure out where the body had gone in. My uncle's murder. He disappeared one day while working at a breakfast place. My grandparent searched for years, checking John Doe's. Grandfather was a mortician, and finally found him after years of searching. They buried him in a proper grave and tried to move on. Someone came in the middle of the night, dug his remains up, and he disappeared once again. They reached out to a psychic and was told he was in the desert in a ditch. Sometime later, a kid playing in the desert found human remains. It was my uncle. He was reburied under a different name in a new location. Both my grandparents have since died, and it really bothers me that they never saw justice for their son. This happened over 50 years ago. They have tried numerous times. They contacted Unsolved Mysteries, and they actually came out and did a story on it, but it was taken off the air before it could have airtime. We did find out he had a son before he died, but I've had no luck trying to find him. The other weird part of the story is the breakfast place he worked. There was no record of it, and it was closed the next day after Uncle went missing. Reddit detectives should solve this case. I would be so happy. I'm using a throwaway account because this is a personal story, not a well-known one unless you're from the area. In which case, I don't particularly want everyone potentially finding out who I am, you know? Last year, on July 6th, my grandparents, aunt, and uncle set out for their little round country United States vacation. Usually it's just my grandparents, but my aunt and uncle went with them too. I believe it had something to do with their anniversary coming up. Anyways, they got to Colorado and their camper was having some mechanical issues, so they pulled over and called someone to come help. They weren't too far away from the national park Mesa Verde, so my aunt and uncle decided to go hike for a little bit. My aunt really wasn't in the best shape at the time. I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it. She was pretty overweight and had some medical issues. They got to a smaller trail off one of the main trails, and my uncle, being the nature lover he was, wanted to go down the trail. My aunt didn't want to go because it wasn't smart in her condition, so he set off by himself. Keep in mind, this trail would have taken a seasoned hiker approximately an hour to finish, so my aunt waits around at the end of the trail. My uncle never came out of the trail. Most people would say, oh, it's a nature trail, maybe something happened and he fell or got attacked by a wild animal. Nope. They sent out search parties, search dogs, helicopters, and they found nothing. The dogs followed his scent for a while, then out of nowhere it disappeared. The weird part is that a few miles away, on a completely different trail, there was a family that claimed they saw my uncle. But unless he had gone back to the main trail, there was no way he could have gotten there. They stopped the search a few days later and my uncle hasn't been found yet. So the family has sort of just accepted the fact that he's probably no longer with us. But it's hard to move on while wondering what happened. Where is his body? How did those people see him when they were not even near where he disappeared? None of it really makes sense.